All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective, and this is our Sunday night sutra study group. And tonight we're gonna read another sutta. Um, I don't know if we'll get all the way through. We might, but just in case, we're reading out of the Majjhima Nikāya, the middle length discourses. And we're moving on to Sutta number 78. This is the Samaṇamuṇḍika Sutta. Samaṇamuṇḍika is a person. He's a paribhajaka, a wanderer. And this is another sutta from the collection of little suttas that the Buddha gave to the wanderers. And if you've been coming to Dharma Doors, you'll know that we've been spending a bit of time with a wanderer named Udayan. And we read Sutta number 77, and then we skipped this one and read Sutta number 79 last week because those were both to this guy Udayan. And then I wanted to come back to talk about this one. So this is a really interesting little sutta. There's like many, many interesting ideas in here, but there's also like one primary kind of question or topic that I actually hear this come up a lot. I kind of get asked questions about this. So let me tell you just what it is, and then we'll like dive in and get to it. But the question that's going to come up tonight is, are babies enlightened? And this is a question that once you start hearing, about the teachings of Buddhism and ideas of no self and ideas of all these things, it might dawn on you, oh, well, then babies are like enlightened, and then they like become unenlightened adults. And then there's a process for kind of getting back to babyhood. But we're going to talk about that tonight. Like that's what the sutta is about, is like given these teachings, should we consider a baby a an invincible ascetic? They will say. So if you don't have this book, by the way, Noe just put a link to the sutta in the chat because there's a version online. There's many versions online. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and dive in because although it's not a very long sutta, it's kind of dense. I just mean that there's like a lot of ideas, and it'll take us a minute to kind of work through them. Let's get to the kind of the first part, this whole bit about babies in that way. So it'll take a moment because there's a little bit of hold on one sec. All right. So once again, this is Sutta 78 in the middle length discourses, the Majjhima Nikāya. And this one's called the Samaṇamuṇḍika. But that's not actually this person's name. The person's name or title, not exactly sure if it's their name, it's this wanderer named Uggahamana. And he's Uggahamana Samaṇamuṇḍika Putta, the putra or putto, the child of the Shramanya Mandika. So you actually are getting the whole person's lineage in their name. So I just want you to know that Samaṇamuṇḍika is actually the name of this person's father or their teacher. We're not exactly sure. But that's the title, really just a quick word about the title. But let's dive in. So it starts like all sutras start. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Buddha, the Blessed One, was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park, a usual place to find the Buddha. But on that occasion, the wanderer Uggahamana Samaṇamuṇḍika Putta, it's a bit of a tongue twister. So on that occasion, the wanderer Uggahamana Samaṇamuṇḍika Putta was staying in Malika's park, Queen Malika's park in the single-halled Tundika plantation for philosophical debates. So this is a special hall built by Queen, she's the Queen of Kusala, Queen Malika. She built a hall adorned with flowers and all kinds of other ornaments. And she built it as a philosophical debating hall. And that's where the wanderers are hanging out in this sutta. But then we're introduced to sort of he's kind of the star, I would say, of this sutta. And it's the carpenter Panchakanga. We've met the carpenter Panchakanga once before. This would have been way back in Sutta 59. That was a sutta. I've taught that sutra a lot actually because it's a sutta called the many kinds of feelings or the many kinds of sensations. And the Buddha tells Panchakanga about Vedana, about sensations. It's kind of a really important sutta. But the thing about the carpenter Panchakanga, he's a lay Buddhist and he's a white-robed lay Buddhist. And he loves sort of not debating, but he loves sort of question and answers. And there are many, many suttas with Panchakanga, the carpenter, asking a bunch of questions. So on this occasion, the carpenter Panchakanga went out from Savatthi at midday in order to see the Buddha, in order to see the Blessed One. But then he thought, it's not the right time to see the Blessed One. He's still in meditative retreat. And it's not the right time to see the Sangha of bhikkhus, the worthy ones of esteem. They're still in meditative retreat as well. Suppose I went to Malika's park to the wanderer Ugahamana Samaṇamuṇḍika Sutta. And so he went to Malika's park. Now, on that occasion, the wanderer Ugahamana was seated with a large assembly of wanderers who were making an uproar, loudly and noisily talking about many kinds of pointless things, such as talk of kings and talk of the oceans. And this is something we've seen in other suttas recently where they're just talking about a bunch of talking politics, things like that, right? And then the wanderer Ugahamana Samaṇamuṇḍika Sutta saw the carpenter Panchakanga coming in the distance. Seeing him, he quieted his own assembly down, saying, "Ooh, sirs, be quiet. Sirs, don't make any noise. Here comes the carpenter Panchakanga, a disciple of the recluse Gautama, the Buddha, one of the recluse Gautama's white-clothed lay disciples staying at Savatthi. These venerable ones, the students of Gautama, they like quiet. They are disciplined in quiet. They commend quiet. Perhaps if he finds our assembly a quiet one, he'll think to join us." And then the wanderers all became silent. The carpenter Panchakanga went to the wanderer Ugahamana and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side, and the wanderer Ugahamana then said to the carpenter, "Gahapati, householder, carpenter, when someone possesses 4 qualities, I describe them as accomplished in what is wholesome, perfected in what is wholesome, an ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment." Now remember, this is Ugahamana talking. What are those 4, carpenter? Here, One does no evil bodily actions, no evil bodily karma. One utters no evil speech. One has no evil intentions. And one does not make their living by any evil livelihood. When someone possesses these four qualities, panchakanga, I describe them as accomplished in what is wholesome, perfected in what is wholesome, and ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment. So that's what Ugahamana teaches. Those are the four qualities of an invincible ascetic. But then, interestingly, the Carpenter Panchakanga neither approved nor disapproved of the wanderer Ugahamana's words. Without doing either of those things, he rose from his seat and he went away, thinking, I shall learn the meaning of this statement in the presence of the Buddha, the Blessed One. So then he went to the Buddha, the Blessed One, and after paying homage to him, he sat down to one side, and he reported to the Blessed One his entire conversation with the wanderer Ugahamana. Thereupon the Buddha, the Blessed One, said this, if that were so, Carpenter, then a young, tender infant lying prone is accomplished in what is wholesome, is perfected in what is wholesome, is an ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment. Well, according to the wanderer Ugahamana's statement. Why? Well, because a young, tender infant lying prone does not even have the notion of a body. So how could they do any evil bodily action beyond a mere wriggling around? A young, tender infant lying prone doesn't even have the notion of speech, like let alone the ability to speak. So how could they utter evil speech beyond mere whining? A young, tender infant lying prone doesn't even have the notion of an intention. So how could they have evil intentions beyond mere sulking? A young, tender infant lying prone doesn't even have the notion of livelihood. So how could it make a living by an evil livelihood beyond being suckled by its mother? So if that were so, Carpenter, then a young, tender infant lying prone is accomplished in what is wholesome. And then they skip it, but is an ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment. Well, at least according to the wanderer Ugahamana's statement. So that's our first, the Buddha counters that idea. But it actually gets more interesting than that. So let's move on to the next part. The Buddha says, when someone possesses four qualities, Carpenter, well, I describe them not as accomplished in what is wholesome or perfected in what is wholesome or an ascetic invincible attained to the supreme attainment, but I say that's one who stands in the same category as a young tender infant lying prone. So what are those four things that make one equal to a young tender infant? Well, here, one does no evil bodily actions. They utter no evil speech. They have no evil intentions. And they do not make a living by any evil livelihood. When someone possesses those four qualities, yeah, I describe them not as accomplished, not as an ascetic, invincible, having attained the ultimate attainment, No, I describe them as one who stands in the same category as a young tender infant lying prone. So it's a pretty straightforward answer to at least for the Buddha, about whether a baby is enlightened. It's not that they're enlightened, they just don't commit evil bodily actions, verbal actions, mental actions, or have the wrong livelihood. Like, so the Buddha's agreeing that, yeah, babies don't have those things. But for me, meaning the Buddha, if some human, some adult person has those four qualities, then I would say that, yeah, they're the same as a baby. That's what I would say, or what he's saying. Any comments, questions, or ideas about that? Pretty straightforward. We're going to go deep on some ideas that were raised. In particular, by the way, we're going to go really deep on the idea of an intention. That's almost like the kind of the big theme of tonight. Um, yeah, we're having this interesting question about whether babies are enlightened, but for practice tonight, we're talking about intentions. So we're going to explore that idea, but it's going to come up in the next section. But any comments or ideas about the baby? All right. So that's sort of the Buddha's retort to Ugahamana's position. Now the Buddha says, and this is where we now get into the actual like teaching. The Buddha says, when someone possesses 10 qualities, carpenter, then I describe them as accomplished in what is wholesome, perfected in what is wholesome, an ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment. Now, at this point, of course, we should really want to know what the Buddha's 10 criteria are for being an invincible ascetic. But we're warning, we're not actually going to hear that list of 10 for a moment. So I just want you to know that something weird's about to happen. So if you have this version, you'll notice that, so the Buddha says, yeah, so according to me, Carpenter, if someone has 10 qualities, they're an invincible ascetic. But first of all, let's get something straight. It must be understood. This must be understood. So this is what we need to understand first, Carpenter, that these are unwholesome habits. And thus, unwholesome habits originate from this. And thus, unwholesome habits cease without remainder here. And thus, one practicing in this way is practicing the way to the cessation of unwholesome habits. Let's dissect that really quickly, because we're not going to get anywhere if we don't understand a lot of what those words mean. So actually, I hadn't even planned on doing it this way, but let me zoom out and let me give you kind of a preview of where we're going here real quick. So the Buddha's about to talk about two different things. In this version, he's going to talk about what are translated as habits and intentions. All right, so those are going to be these two categories he's going to be working with. Habits is the word shila, and shila is usually translated as discipline. But I actually really like and I really appreciate translating it as habits, because shila is normally something like refraining from violence, for example. So that's a definite, that's like number one aspect, ahimsa, refraining from violence, refraining from killing. Now, the point is, though, is that if you refrain from being violent, you're making it a habit of not being violent. Similarly, if you participate in violence a lot, you make it a habit Like that's the go-to place in that sense. So even though Shila, moral discipline, as it might be translated, even though Shila is normally translated that way, I really like this language of a habit. And so what we're talking about is unwholesome habits and then wholesome habits. And then we're going to talk about intentions, samkalpa, and then we're going to talk about wholesome intentions and unwholesome intentions. So we have two ideas, and each of those ideas has two options, wholesome and unwholesome, kushala, akushala. Everybody with me? But now we need to understand what is going on here when the Buddha is saying these weird things like, these are unwholesome states. What are? This is the cessation of it. Here. Where? What are you talking about? Well, what I want you to recognize, and you may have already picked up on it, but the formula here is the formula that we are used to seeing in regards to the Four Noble Truths. So if you know your Dharma, if you know your Buddha Dharma, you know that there's this really important teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And those Four Noble Truths are about declaring what suffering is. So this is suffering. Like the Buddha is, and Buddha Dharma, Buddhism is pointing at what suffering is. Number one, that there is suffering. Number two is why. What is the origin of suffering? Well, one who knows the origin of suffering. Number three is the cessation of suffering. Is, well, how do we bring that suffering to cessation? How do we get rid of it? Well, that's the third noble truth, is that there is the cessation of suffering. If we couldn't get rid of suffering, there kind of maybe wouldn't be Buddhism, or Buddhism would be very different. But the point of the third noble truth is that suffering can be ended. There is the cessation of suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the path, the marga, the path that leads to the very cessation of suffering. And of course, that path is the Noble Eightfold Path. So the formula for contemplating the Four Noble Truths is that there's an origin, there's the cessation, and there's the path. That same formula in the world of Buddhism can be applied almost to any teaching that the Buddha gave in terms of like analyzing it. And so right here, what he's doing is he's analyzing Shila, habits, in terms of good habits, bad habits. And then let me kind of reread this real quickly. He's using that Four Noble Truth model to say, you should be thinking about it this way. These are unwholesome habits. Unwholesome habits originate from this. Unwholesome habits cease without remainder over here. And thus, one practicing in this way is practicing the way to the cessation of unwholesome bad habits. And the Buddha says that it must be understood this way as well. There are wholesome habits. There are good habits. Wholesome habits originate from this. And thus wholesome habits cease without remainder over here. And thus one practicing in this way is practicing the way to the cessation of wholesome habits. Cessation of wholesome habits? Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that idea because I know that that raises an eyebrow. I thought we were trying to promote wholesome habits, right? All right, so the Buddha just walked us through the fourfold turning of the Dharma wheel, as it's called, that there is origin, cessation, and path. but he did it in regards to good habits or good shila, or I should say unwholesome habits and wholesome habits. And then in this same paragraph, paragraph 9, the big paragraph, he then switches to unwholesome samkalpa, unwholesome intentions. By the way, if you're wondering what any of these things mean, the Buddha is going to tell us. This is the way sutras work. They kind of like they get you wanting to know what these things mean first, and then they'll tell you. So, regarding samkalpa, intentions, the Buddha says you should understand it this way. These are unwholesome intentions. Unwholesome intentions originate from this. Unwholesome intentions cease without remainder, over here. And thus, one practicing in this way is practicing the way to the cessation of unwholesome intentions. And I say, it must be understood this way, that these are wholesome, good intentions. And wholesome intentions originate from this, and thus wholesome intentions cease without remainder here, and thus one practicing in this way is practicing the way to the cessation of wholesome intentions. Once again, we're curious. Cessation of wholesome intentions, why would we want those to go away? So, that's the Buddha stating everything he's about to talk about. Shila and samkalpa, which is to say habits and intentions, both good and bad, and he's about to break down the definition of what they are, where they come from, what causes them to cease, or that there is the cessation, and then the path to that. So now we start. So now the Buddha has said, first, you should think about all of that first, which we just did. And now, of course, you have been wondering. Paragraph 10. What are unwholesome habits? What are akushala shila? They are, the Buddha says, unwholesome bodily karmic actions, unwholesome verbal actions, and evil livelihood. These are called unwholesome habits. And what do these unwholesome habits originate from? Where do they come from? Well, their origin is stated thus. They should be said to originate from chitta, from mind. What mind? Though the mind is multiple, varied, and of different aspects, there is mind affected by greed or lust or desire, mind affected by hatred or ill will or aversion, and a mind affected by delusion or confusion or ignorance. Unwholesome habits originate from this. And where do these unwholesome habits cease without remainder? Their cessation is stated this way. Here, a practitioner, a bhikkhu, sorry, I find my spot. Here, a bhikkhu abandons bodily misconduct and develops good bodily conduct. They abandon verbal misconduct and develop good verbal conduct. They abandon mental disconduct and develop good mental conduct. They abandon wrong livelihood and gain a living by right livelihood. And it's here that unwholesome habits cease without remainder. So, well, let's finish up. We'll do the fourth one. And how, you may ask? And how practicing does one practice the way to the cessation of unwholesome habits? Well, here a practitioner, a bhikkhu, awakens zeal for the non-arising of unarisen evil, unwholesome states. And they make an effort. They arouse energy, exert the mind, and strive. They awaken zeal for the abandoning of arisen evil, unwholesome states. They awaken zeal for the arising of unarisen wholesome states. And they awaken zeal for the continuance, the non-disappearance, the strengthening and increasing and fulfillment by development of arisen wholesome states. And they make an effort, arouse energy, exert the mind, and strive. One so practicing practices the way to the cessation of unwholesome habits. And then we're going to find out what wholesome habits are. That was our section about unwholesome habits. So let's go back really quickly. What are unwholesome habits, right? Well, they are unwholesome bodily actions, such as being violent, stealing or taking what has not been given, being deceptive, being harsh with one's speech, right? Being abusive with our sexual energy or abusing sensuality, intoxication. These are all bodily misconduct in that way. So what unwholesome verbal actions actually are: the speaking falsely, speaking idly, speaking harshly, all of that. And then the idea of livelihood. So I want to remind everybody that the idea of ajiva, like towards the promotion of jiva, so towards the promotion of life, is what ajiva means. It's translated as livelihood, but I always like to remind everybody that in the context of these suttas, livelihood is how do you eat every day? Like, this is not about a job or money exactly. It's actually like, how do you survive? That's what ajiva means. Like, how do you manage to get food every day? And in the early form of Buddhism, kind of the only correct way to get food every day was to beg for it. And there was a whole thing in the early Buddhism about not keeping leftovers and like so that tomorrow I don't have to go around and beg. No, right livelihood in the early Buddhist tradition was about humility and begging for that food rather than laboring for it, rather than destroying the earth and worms and bugs and things for it. All kinds of prohibitions about like doing things to get food. Things like fortune telling, that was off limits. Um, there's a big one about running errands. That's bad livelihood. Like basically if somebody's like, you know what, I'll give you a little bit of food if you just run this note over to so-and-so's house. That's considered wrong livelihood. The only right livelihood in the original kind of context was humble begging. And basically, if the person gave the food of their own will without any conditions, like you have to run an errand for me, then that was considered right livelihood. Just mentioning that for context. Yeah, Buddhism, of course, evolves, and the idea of right livelihood is, it varies from tradition to tradition. But to make sense of our sutta, I want to remind you of that. So those are the three aspects of unwholesome habits: bodily, verbal, and livelihood. Now, at that point, you might be wondering, wait, bodily karma, vocal karma, and livelihood, which is kind of has to do with my body in a way, like terms of survival. What about the mind? Isn't it body, speech, mind? That's what the whole intention part of this sutta is going to be about in a moment. Intention is about the mind. Then there's the body and what it's doing, and the voice and how that's happening. So, all right, so that's our what are unwholesome habits. Pretty straightforward, and especially from a Buddhist point of view. But where do they originate from? Chitta, mind. And I'll tell you, I have spent basically since last Sunday, I've spent all week digging into this paragraph because this is so curious, where the Buddha says, all right, where do unwholesome habits come from? The mind, chitta. That's not a surprising answer. Like that's pretty straightforward Buddha Dharma. But then the Buddha says, and what mind? What chitta? He says, though mind is multiple, varied, and of different aspects, there is mind affected by desire, mind affected by hatred, and mind affected by delusion. Unwholesome habits originate from mind affected by those three poisons, the three poisons. I do not know exactly what it means. I mean, I have suspicions. I will probably tell you my suspicions, but I'm not quite exactly sure what the Buddha's talking about in terms of chitta, mind, being multiple, varied, and of different aspects. The one thing that I can tell you, just from having studied Buddhist psychology quite, in depth, in the world of Buddhism, it's important to kind of remember that the general psychology of this situation, I'm pointing at my being here. The general makeup of this situation is that there's a kind of what the Buddhists call I awareness or I consciousness and ear consciousness and nose consciousness and tongue consciousness and bodily consciousness or awareness, and then a brain consciousness or awareness. In the Western tradition, we tend to only think of mind as what's going on with the brain. Like mind and brain are synonymous kind of in the Western tradition. I know there's like fringe theories, but in general, there's an understanding that the brain is the seat of consciousness, is mind. But in the Buddhist tradition, it's more uh, an amalgamation, or to use the Buddhist language, an aggregation. It's a skandha. And so mind is multiple in that there's this, I like to say that chitta in the Buddhist tradition is better translated as a mind state. And that mind state is shifting and changing kshana to kshana, what the Buddhists call thought moment by thought moment. And so at any given thought moment, like right now, there is a state of mind. And that particular state of mind is a kind of epiphenomenal, emergent thing that is the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the brain all kind of working together to then generate this epiphenomenal mind state. And that epiphenomenal mind state can be affected or inflicted with greed, anger, and delusion, the three poisons. And the entire project of Buddhism is about eradicating the three poisons from its malware in the operating system. And the malware is to be extracted. So greed, call it addiction, over desire, anger, and delusion are the three poisons that we're trying to eradicate. And the Buddha is saying, yeah, that's the origin of unwholesome habits. Mind affected by the three poisons. So now we know what are unwholesome habits. We know where they come from. And then we now also know where they cease. And this is when a practitioner abandons bodily misconduct and develops good bodily conduct. So sometimes we have our go-to place of getting angry, and that's considered unwholesome. It's not considered conducive to awakening. In fact, getting angry is considered a hindrance, an obstacle, a scandalon, a blockage in that way. And so we want to kind of, basically from a Buddhist point of view, we want to recognize that when something happens that perturbs us or something and we get angry, we are practicing getting angry in that way. And so if a practitioner can abandon unwholesome bodily things or, things like that, and then begin to make it a habit of not doing that, that leads to the ultimate cessation of these unwholesome habits. I'm not going to get too into it. We're kind of, this is going very well. I don't want to get too into like commentary, but I kind of just want to mention that there's an analysis of this sutra that the Buddha is actually walking us through the 4 stages of stream entry, once returner, non-returner, arhat. And just in case you're curious, this is all in the footnotes, Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhikkhu Nyanamoli's footnotes. But at that point, when the bhikkhu or the practitioner has abandoned bodily misconduct and developed good bodily conduct, and abandoned verbal misconduct and developed good verbal conduct, and abandoned mental misconduct and developed good mental conduct, and abandoned wrong livelihood, developed right livelihood, then that's where unwholesome habits cease. And that, by the commentary tradition, is the state of a stream enterer. FYI, in that way. And then we get the final, which is, or not the final, but we get and how practicing, does one practice the path, practice the way? So this is the final one for unwholesome habits. What is the path to the cessation of the unwholesome habits? And if you didn't recognize it when I read it the first time, what's being spoken about here are what are called the 4 right efforts. And it's basically about, if you notice that you're angry, and so there is the arisen unwholesome state of anger, the idea is that you should have, generate zeal in that way, it says, right? Awaken energy for the abandoning of that arisen unwholesome state. So in other words, if there's you're starting to get angry, there are things that we can do to make that anger increase, right? We can start seething, we can start like plotting and planning, or in a way we could just let it go. And one version, the first version, is adding fuel to the fire and getting the anger more and more and more. This is suggesting, no. If there is this arising, the slight arising of an unwholesome habit, you should work to kind of get rid of it. And if it's one of those days where you're like, you know what, I'm feeling really kind and compassionate towards all beings, I'm not actually feeling very angry. So there's no arisen unwholesome state. Try to keep it that way. So that's 2 of the right efforts, that if there's a little bit of anger, you try to get rid of it in that way. And if you notice there's no anger, you try to keep it that way. The other 2 right efforts that are spoken of here is that if there's a wholesome, like you notice this metta, you notice this loving kindness and compassion for all beings, try to keep it going, keep it up, keep that feeling. And then if you notice that you're not having that loving kindness feeling towards all beings, work on generating such a feeling. So don't work on being angry. Don't practice being angry. Practice being kind. Work on being kind. And that's that section on the path leading to the cessation of the unwholesome habits. And then the end of that paragraph, by the way, one so practicing practices the way to the cessation of unwholesome habits. And in the commentary tradition, that's when we actually reach the fruit of being a stream enterer. Because in this fourfold path, you get in the stage, and then you attain the fruit of that stage. And then you move to the next stage and attain the fruit of that stage. So, all right, so we officially have walked all the way through that whole kind of structure regarding unwholesome shila, akushala shila, unwholesome habits. We've walked all the way through it, what they are, where they come from, their cessation, and what causes their cessation. Next up, what are wholesome habits? So what are good habits? What are kushala shila? Well, they are wholesome, wholesome bodily actions. They're wholesome verbal actions. And purification of livelihood. These are called wholesome habits. Not a big surprise, but not to be glossed over too quickly. So wholesome habits, good, wholesome bodily actions. So again, those are things like being kind, helping people with our body, things like that, avoiding the unwholesome bodily things. Wholesome verbal actions, being honest, being truthful, being kind, all of that. And then, of course, the purification of livelihood. So, and what do these wholesome habits originate from? So where do good habits come from? Well, their origin is stated such. They should be said to originate from mind. What mind, you may ask? Though mind is multiple, varied, and of different aspects, there is the mind unaffected by lust or desire, unaffected by hate, unaffected by delusion. Wholesome habits originate from a mind free of the three poisons. And where do these wholesome habits cease without remainder? Ah, this is the curious part. This is what we want to kind of spend a little bit of time on. So where do wholesome habits cease? Their cessation is stated this way. Here, a practitioner, a bhikkhu, is virtuous, but they do not identify with that virtue. And they understand as it actually is the deliverance of mind and deliverance by wisdom, where these wholesome habits cease without remainder. And now I want to do something that I kind of actually rarely do. I want to read Bhikkhu Bodhi's footnote on this one because it's super helpful. So if for some reason you don't happen to have the wisdom edition, so Bhikkhu Bodhi mentions that idea of the cessation of wholesome habits, the footnote is that this passage shows the arahat, so the fully enlightened bhikkhu, right? He says this passage shows the arahat who maintains virtuous conduct, but no longer identifies with this virtue by conceiving of it as I and mine. And so since their virtue, or since their virtuous habits no longer generate karma, they're not describable as wholesome. a very subtle but important point about Buddha Dharma, that at that level of an arahat, there's even that transcendence and cessation of what might be called good, the good stuff in that way. And this is sort of, for if you've been coming to Dharma doors or you kind of been studying Mahayana Dharma with me, this is sort of something that we would more associate with like Mahayana Dharma, a kind of beyond the dualities of good and bad and all of that. But it's right here in the old Dharma. And this idea that this person, bhikkhu, bhikkhuni, whoever, but this person, this idea that there's even the cessation of the wholesome habits, but it's a cessation of them because there's nobody claiming to have them. And that's where it's saying it, but it's not that the practitioner is going to like start doing bad things at that point. No, no, no. They're still always going to be honest, not violent, all of those things. But they've even reached the point where they recognize and understand that there's no me being pure. There's no my good action, my bad action. And that, of course, is, that's the teaching of no self. That's the kind of goal of early Buddhism. I would say the goal of early Buddhism is to understand that state of um, beyond conceit, it's called, beyond the I and mine. Mahayana Buddhism is probably a little bit leaning more towards the emptiness of all phenomena, the emptiness of all dharmas. Early Buddhism's just a little more hyper focused on the emptiness of the ego self owner in that way. So, any questions about that interesting idea of the cessation of even the wholesome habits? Cool. And then, and how, so now that we know what it means for the cessation, we should be curious. How do you do that? How do you achieve such a state of egoless goodness in that sense, right? So, and how, practicing, does one practice the way to the cessation of wholesome habits? Well, once again, here a practitioner awakens zeal for the non-arising of unarisen evil, unwholesome states, for the continuance, non-disappearance, strengthening, increase, and fulfillment by development of arisen, wholesome states. Yeah, and they've left out a lot there. And they make an effort to arouse energy, exert the mind, and strive. One so practicing this way, it leads to the cessation of wholesome habits or wholesome shila. So that means we've finished the part about wholesome habits in those fourfold ways. Now we're going to move on to samkalpa, intentions. So, oh, good, we're making good time. So, this is a really important Buddhist idea. So, the word is sankappa in Pali, but I usually use more Sanskrit pronunciation of these words, so samkalpa. And if you know the word kalpa, you might be thinking of the time period, what is usually translated as like an eon. In the world of Buddhism, or just actually in the world of Indian cosmology, there is the idea of a kalpa, which is a well, it'll make sense in a minute. Even though a kalpa is a measurement of time, the word kalpa, it sort of means like an amassing, like an accrual, a building up, if you will. And when you know that the word kalpa is actually this kind of building up, then you can kind of make that connection to why a kalpa is the period of time it takes for a world to form. So the kalpa is referring to the forming of the world, not exactly the chronological measurement of time. Now, there's another definition of kalpa, which is not the time it takes for a world to form. There's a mental kalpa. And a mental kalpa, or just a kalpa, is kind of basically like just a thought. In fact, if you get out your, like I did, if you get out your just Sanskrit dictionary and look up kalpa, the basic definition is just a thought. But this is not kalpa, this is samkalpa. And the basic idea of a samkalpa is that it's a particular thought that's like directed. It's a thought that has this kind of intention. It's why samkalpa is translated as intention. So it's like the sum of samkalpa. It makes it a kind of like a directed thought in that way. And a samkalpa as an intention. In the world of Buddhism, it's basically synonymous with pranidhana, with a vow, making a vow. So a samkalpa is basically a vow, or again, an intention. And now what we're talking about as we move into this last section, we're talking about like, so I often use this example, and really quickly, let me kind of repeat this example to kind of point out what exactly is a samkalpa. Well, an intention in Buddhism would be the intention, the wish to not be violent. Like that's one samkalpa, for example, is the intention or the wish to not be violent. And the idea is that I'm setting this intention for my practice, for my life, that it's like, you know what? I don't want to be violent. And so I'm setting this intention to not be violent. There's a different way of thinking about this, and this is my example that I've used in the past. It could be that you were like me in like college and after college, where I was a vegan and I identified as a vegan, and I did not eat animal products, and I thought it was wrong, and I didn't wear leather and all of that. And if you asked me why, oh, I would tell you. Like I had a vegan soapbox, and I would, stand on it. So, but my realization after I've, practice and study and teach, I realized that my veganism was really caught up in a lot of ideology and really caught up in a lot of ego and really just caught up in a lot of other stuff. And what I realized was setting the intention of not being violent satisfies my vegan desires to not be violent. But what's interesting about the intention of not being violent, there's no ideology behind it. I mean, I guess you could get, in fact, I don't want to open this up just yet because of where the sutra is going, but in many ways, an intention in Buddhism is ideology free. And I'm going to explain why that is in like 10 minutes. So I just kind of want to make that connection between like, you know, having a view, having a like a worldview, having an ethic, a moral compass. And I just kind of want to point at what is going on with a samkalpa, that it's a very sophisticated Buddhist way of achieving certain goals without getting caught in a bunch of other stuff. So that was a lot of stuff about Samkalpa, like etymology, all of that. All you need to know, though, is that it's like an intention. Questions about Samkalpa before we move any further? Well, the Buddha would tell us, right? I'm at the bottom of page 651, paragraph 12. And what are unwholesome intentions? Let's start with the definition of what they are. Well, they are the intention of sensual desire, the intention of ill will, and the intention of cruelty. These are called unwholesome intentions. So, the intention of sensual desire, that could be, we're talking about kama, right? So, sensual desire, usually, in early Buddhism associated with sexuality, but I like to point out it's whatever you can't live without in that way. That's sensual pleasure. And it's kind of different for everybody. But that idea that there's something desirable that kind of rules over us in that way, that's what is an unwholesome intention, is the intention to kind of fulfill those sensual desires. The intention to be ill, to have ill will, or the intention to be cruel. And what do these unwholesome intentions originate from? Their origin is stated this. They should be said to originate from samnya, from perception. What perception? Though perception is multiple, here's that language again. Though perception is multiple, varied, and of different aspects, there is perception of sensual desire, perception of ill will, and perception of cruelty. Unwholesome intentions originate from this. So once again, we need to dissect this term samnya, or perception. So it's not the mind as it was with our habits, like the last two. Now we're talking about samkalpa, and in particular right now we're talking about unwholesome, bad intentions. And where do bad intentions come from? Perception. Samnya. Well, let me remind you, samnya is one of the five aggregates. It's one of the five skandhas. Let me remind you, the five skandhas are about you, but I don't mean you, because that would be the ego, that would be manas. But in terms of the sentient subject, the sentient subject is understood to be an amalgamation or an aggregation of material stuff, form, rupa, sensations, which are pleasing or not pleasing visions and sounds and smells. So eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, brain, the body of form. Sensations, ooh, perception, our conditioning, samskara, and then the fifth aggregate, consciousness. So right now, what's going on over there is a particular formation of bodily organs having certain sensations, perceiving certain things. Those things are being filtered through all of your past experience and habits. And then that's what's giving rise to this present state of conscious awareness. And it's changing thought moment to thought moment. But what's the role of perception in all of that? Well, let's use this example. Where's my friends? Hold on one sec. I'm just going to grab my friends over here. So I always like to use this example in talking about perception. Because the idea here is I always like to use this example and I like to mention, or I like to pretend, so play along with me for a moment. It might be that you're perceiving two faces, but it also might be that you're perceiving a kind of candlestick, but I like to call it a kind of like a wine glass. And what I want you to notice is that, let's say, just for the sake of, like, just for hypothetical sake, let's say these two faces reminded you of two people that you don't like. In fact, like you have ill will and cruel thoughts towards these people, right? But let's then say though that you love champagne or wine or whatever. And so what I want you to be thinking about is the role of perception and the arising of desire or ill will. And I want you to notice how whether you like, ooh, champagne, or ooh, those guys. I want you to notice that your disposition is determined by your perception, by like what you think you are seeing in that way. And the reason why I always like to use this example is that it might be that you're seeing the two people, but it might be that somebody else is seeing the wine glass. And that's a really good example of how one aggregation of the five aggregates is that body of form, having those sensations, perceiving that. And that perception, of course, is being filtered through your past experiences, and that's what's giving rise to a conscious state of, ooh, a champagne glass. But then there's the other aggregation of five skandhas that's perceiving the two faces and is having an entirely different conscious experience, and it's full of ill will. Same object? That's an interesting question, right? Are they looking at the same object? But you get my point that you have two different perceptions leading to two different states of mind. So that's where the Buddha, or at least that's how I understand why the Buddha is saying that the origin of unwholesome intentions, it originates with what your perception is. Like, and that's really important to understand that that's an aspect of the arising of mental states is your perception. And remembering that it's just your perception. You're not seeing objective reality, right? You're seeing a phenomenological manifestation. All right, so that is the origin of unwholesome intentions. They originate from perception. And where do these unwholesome intentions cease without remainder? How do we kind of get rid of bad intentions? Well, their cessation is stated to be this way. Here, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a practitioner enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. It is here that unwholesome intentions cease without remainder. So if you've been coming to Dharma Doors lately, we've heard the jhana paragraph many, many times. So classic example of the Buddha being like, and how do you get rid of bad intentions? Enter the first jhana, guaranteed. All right, let's keep moving. And how practicing does one practice the way to the cessation of unwholesome intentions? Well, same as before, here a practitioner awakens zeal for the non-arising of unarisen evil unwholesome states, And then it goes in the complete version of the sutta, it goes through all, forms of this in terms of, well, I said it before, I won't say it again. And so you arouse zeal, rouse energy for the continuance, for the non-disappearance, for the strengthening, increase, and fulfillment by development of arisen wholesome states. And one makes an effort, arouses energy, exerts the mind, and strives. One so practicing practices the way to the cessation of unwholesome intentions. Yeah. And now our final category, wholesome intentions. So one last time, everybody. And what are wholesome intentions? What are kushala samkalpa? They are the intention of renunciation, the intention of ill will, or sorry, the intention of non-ill will, of course, and the intention of non-cruelty. These are called wholesome intentions. So, in terms of the language of renunciation, we need to put that next to the other one, which was, it was about fulfilling sensual pleasures. This is renunciation. So if you have your whatever you might be overly desirous of, or God forbid, addicted to, if you have that thing, then there's this intention, this sensual, oh, I want that sensual pleasure. I want that particular sensual pleasure. This is saying that the way to kind of get rid of those unwholesome intentions, or at least one wholesome intention, is not doing that. You have a problem drinking, that one time, don't do it. Just don't. I know it's hard. All of this is hard, but the renunciation of it, that's a wholesome intention. And of course, this is what every kind of alcoholic makes, is the wholesome intention to renounce drinking. Anybody who has an addiction to anything makes a wholesome intention to not do that. And then the other two, of course, the intention of not getting angry, no ill will, and the intention of not being cruel. And by the way, in Buddhism, it's cruelty and compassion. So just cruelty and compassion are opposites in the Buddhist world, FYI. All right. So, and what do these wholesome intentions that we just talked about, what do they originate from? Where do they come from? Well, their origin is stated this way. They should be said to originate from perception. What perception, you may ask? Well, though perception is multiple, varied, and different aspects, there is perception of renunciation. There's perception of non-ill will and perception of non-cruelty. Wholesome intentions originate from that. And where do these wholesome intentions cease without remainder? Their cessation is stated to be this. Here, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a practitioner enters upon and abides in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind, without applied and sustained thought, without vitarka and vichaya, with piti and sukha, with rapture and pleasure, but now it's born of concentration. It is here that these wholesome intentions cease without remainder. So once again, the idea is you get into the second jhana and there's no more me and my intentions and all of that, because you're just in this meditative state that has no applied and sustained thought. And then, and how? Practicing, does one practice the way to the cessation of wholesome states, or wholesome intentions, I should say? Once again, a bhikkhu, a practitioner, awakens zeal for the non-arising of unarisen evil, unwholesome states, for the continuance, non-disappearance, strengthening, increase, and fulfillment by development of arisen, wholesome states. And one makes effort, arouses energy, exerts the mind, and strives. So one so practicing practices the way to the cessation of wholesome intentions. There you have it. We've gone all the way through both Shila and Samkalpa, good and bad, and we've walked through it the 4 different ways. I want to congratulate you. That's a lot of turns of the Dharma wheel we just did. And that's part of the language of turning the Dharma wheel, is actually doing that same way of thinking over and over, but to different topics. All right. So there you have it. And you might be wondering, as I was wondering, where are these 10 qualities that the Buddha told us about at the beginning? It's why I felt compelled to get to the end of the sutra tonight, because the Buddha set us up for what are the 10 qualities of an actual invincible ascetic attained to the highest attainment, right? Well, the Buddha needed to tell us all of that first so that we would be familiar with all the words, familiar with all the ideas. And now, Carpenter, when someone possesses what 10 qualities? What do, or when someone possesses what 10 qualities do I describe them as accomplished in what is wholesome, perfected in what is wholesome, an ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment? Well, here, a practitioner possesses the right view of one beyond training, the right intention, the right samkalpa of one beyond training, the right speech of one beyond training, the right action, bodily action of one beyond training, the right livelihood of one beyond training, the right effort of one beyond training, the right mindfulness of one beyond training, the right concentration or samadhi of one beyond training, the right knowledge of one beyond training, and the right vimukti or liberation or deliverance of one beyond training. When someone possesses these 10 qualities, I describe them as accomplished in what is wholesome, perfected in what is wholesome, an ascetic, invincible, attained to the supreme attainment. This is what the Blessed One said. The carpenter Panchakanga was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. All right, so that last part there, you might have noticed, it sounds a lot like the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so on. But with 2 additional extras: knowledge and liberation. So jnana and vimukti are the additional 2. But there's also the addition of the word asankhya or asekya, which means for like one beyond training, which, by the way, is just language for an arahat. An arahat has nothing more to learn in that way. They're beyond training. And now, really quickly, because we have a few minutes, I wanted to kind of like mention what I was saying before about there's kind of, you could be a vegan and have this kind of ideology, and then your actions are coming from an ideology versus setting an intention, and that's a samkalpa. And then that, I said earlier that that is not ideological. And now let me tell you why I would say that. It has to do with the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the right view. the right drishtihi or dittihi, as it is said in Pali. So the whole point is that a view is an ideology. Like, an ideology is a very modern, almost postmodern, very philosophical term. But what a drishti is an ideology. It's a view, it's a worldview, it's an opinion in that sense. And basically, this is a whole other Dharma talk, and it's too late to get into it. But basically, the right view in Buddhism is to not have a view, meaning to not be clinging to an ideology. And the reason why that is, and there's entire suttas about this, it's where the Buddha talks about how clinging to a view, yeah, that leads to the picking up of stick and sword and the conflict. That's what the Buddha says views lead to. So the first kind of step in the Noble Eightfold Path is having the right view, which again is arguably not clinging to a view. And then what we want to realize as kind of like practitioners is we want to then be like, okay, then what like perpetuates having a view versus what starts to kind of eliminate having a view. And now if we move to the second one, the right intention, and the Buddha defined the right intention as renunciation. So the point is that to not renunciate, and just in case anybody got lost, with renunciation, I'm not talking about becoming a monk or a nun. Again, I'm just talking about that not fulfilling that sensual pleasure that you would want to, but kind of withholding in that way. That's renunciation. That's a samkalpa, as the Buddha said. And what I want us to kind of think about is how acting on sensual pleasures, and especially acting on sensual pleasures all the time, that actually is very conducive to formulating a view, clinging to a view, and all of that. Whereas if I have the intention to not be cruel, to renounce sensual pleasures in that way, my intention is in line with this kind of not holding to a view. So that's how that is how a samkalpa is not ideological, because it's the intention to not be ideological, if you see what I mean. And yes, Buddhism is very, very aware that that can quickly become an ideology, meaning the ideology of not holding an ideology. Buddhism is aware that the mind wants to do that. It wants to cling to an ideology. And so it'll be like, oh, that's a great idea, Buddha. That's my new ideology. No, you have to practice not clinging to an ideology. You do not hold an ideology in that sense. You practice not doing that. And what you'll begin to notice, especially like kind of, just in the world of discourse, if you start to lay down your own ideology, you will begin to notice that all conflict and fighting is about people holding on to their ideologies. And it's the idea of I'm right, you're wrong. And this Buddha Dharma is really in a place of like, how about like beyond delusions of right and wrong in that way? So that was my little spiel about how a samkalpa is not an ideology. And we did the sutta. Amazing. Incredible. Questions, comments, ideas, epiphanies, realizations, anything?
What what was the Carpenter's Sutta that you had mentioned in the
Ah,
beginning?
it's called the Bahuvedaniya Sutta. It's number 59 in the same collection. So Sutta 59 in the Majjhima Nikāya. And I believe, let me double check that. Yeah, Bahu Vedaniya, the many kinds of feeling. I also call it the Sutta of the 108 feelings because it's an interesting sutta where the Buddha actually breaks down that number 108, that kind of mysterious, mystical, magical number of India. I'm not saying that this is the origin of that magical number, but it is interesting to notice the Buddha's description of where it comes from. So it's too late for me to get into that, but that is the sutta. So, yep. Yeah, Maria.
I just have a comment. I always find it so um, such an interesting place. This razor's edge, I think I referred to it as the hair's breadth of opportunity to anything that's born out of free will. So because Buddhism is so deterministic in many ways, most ways, it's interesting to pay attention to where those opportunities come up and really try to take advantage of them as much as possible. But it's interesting to me that they even exist within that deterministic framework.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my comment.
Maria, that's an excellent comment. Buddhism, of course, is extremely deterministic in that way. But as we've spoken about before, there is agency. But as Maria said with her kind of like that hair's breadth, the idea though is that a big chunk of what's going on here is conditioned, habitual, determined action. And the problem is that if you don't know that, you'll keep repeating habitual conditioned actions and never find that the place for the agency in that sense. And if you're curious, well, where is that place, Michael? Where is that place of agency? It's in meditation. It's actually in the not doing. That's where you have agency, is the not taking of the drink, the not indulging in the sensual pleasure in that way. The conditioned habit, though, the conditioned habit of samsara is to fulfill that sensual pleasure. The conditioned habit of samsara is to get mad and defend oneself. That's the evolutionary biological program. And so to not do that is very hard from an evolutionary biological point of view. And it's why, actually, if we go full circle on this, by the way, excellent, Maria, for jogging all of these ideas. If we go back now to the beginning, the baby, I don't think a baby could do what the Buddha was talking about. Because the Buddha was talking about the baby being like, you know what, mom? I'll have that bottle a little later. I'll have the milk a little later. No, babies are like, now, give me the milk now. And so the idea here is the Buddha saying, no, an accomplished, invincible ascetic is one that can control themselves. And a baby cannot, in a way, do that. So that's where Maria's comment about that hair's breadth of room that we have for to actually make a change. It's tricky to do this, even for adults in that sense. So thanks, Maria. All right, everybody. Unless there's any other comments, questions, or ideas, that'll conclude tonight's Dharma Doors. Thank you all for being here so much. I appreciate it so much. And I'll see you. Question, Helena? Or just saying, oh, please.
Yeah, it's Helena. I wanted to say hello and just thank you to everyone, but especially you, MC. I am so grateful to have found this. You're such a wonderful speaker. There are so many good things I would say, and it was very much right on time, everything that you delivered. It was gorgeous. I'm just very appreciative. Wonderful dialogue. I'm just, yeah, very happy. So thank you.
come back for more. Thank you for that. Thank you all.